The morning air smelled like cedar and fresh paint the day Daniel rolled up the last moving box into their new home. Nestled in the quiet folds of Willow Ridge Estates, a well-manicured, HOA-regulated neighborhood, the house was modest but beautiful. White trim blue shutters and a ramp he'd installed with his own hands. It was more than just a house. It was supposed to be their fresh start. After everything they'd endured, this felt like a reward. A reset button for a life interrupted. Daniel had been a firefighter for 17 years before the accident. He'd faced collapsing buildings and roaring flames, but nothing had ever terrified him like that rainy night on Highway 7. One careless driver, one split second, one twist of fate. That's all it took to change his daughter's life forever. Lila, just 10 years old, had always been curious and bold, with mismatched socks and a backpack full of books. After the crash, she didn't speak for 3 months. The doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. Daniel called it a silence that haunted every room they lived in. He spent sleepless nights reading to her, learning how to braid her hair with trembling hands, and building ramps from scratch, trying piece by piece to reassemble the world for her. Moving to Willow Ridge felt like the final piece. The brochure had boasted about peaceful living, community safety, and inclusive values. Daniel believed it. He wanted to believe it. A safe neighborhood. Good sidewalks. Apart 2 blocks away. It wasn't just for him. It was for Lila to give her a sense of normalcy. Maybe even friends. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet, really. Neighbors offered polite nods, but rarely introductions. Daniel chalked it up to people being busy. He waved anyway. He smiled when Lila rolled next to him on their evening walks, her service dog, Mabel trotting loyally at her side. Mabel had been trained to help Lila with doors, dropped objects, even emotional support. In Daniel's eyes, the dog was a guardian angel with fur. It wasn't until the 3rd day that he noticed the way some heads turned when they passed by. Not friendly interest, more like disapproval wrapped in fake smiles. On Friday afternoon, as Daniel adjusted the porch flower pots, a woman walking her Pomeranian slowed down in front of the yard and stared. She didn't wave, just stared at Lila in her chair, then shook her head slightly and walked on. Daniel told himself not to read into it, but it kept happening. One neighbor, a man in a golf cart who looked like a retired senator, paused long enough to glare at the ramp Daniel had built and muttered something about aesthetics. Another, a younger woman jogging with earbuds, visibly swerved to avoid Mabel as if service dogs carried disease. Then came the letter. Folded neatly and stuck into their mailbox without postage, it was from the Willow Ridge HOA Welcome Committee, or so it claimed. The note, written in thick, looping handwriting, welcomed them to the neighborhood, but offered a gentle reminder that modifications to exterior structures, including ramps, must be pre-approved by the board to maintain visual harmony. No name, no contact information, just a line at the bottom. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining our community standards. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He'd reviewed the HOA bylaws before moving in. The ramp was temporary and removable, compliant with ADA guidelines. But he didn't want to cause waves. Not yet. Not with Lila finally smiling again when she saw Mabel chase butterflies in the backyard. By the following week, the murmurs turned into subtle signs. Chalk graffiti appeared on their driveway. Childish scribbles at first, then crude wheelchair drawings. Their trash bin was accidentally skipped on pickup day. Lila's flower planter, the one she painted herself, was kicked over. Daniel fixed it and said nothing. One afternoon, Daniel took Lila to the community pool, not to swim, but just to sit nearby, listen to the laughter, feel the sun. As they settled under a shaded bench, a few mothers gathered their children and walked away. Daniel noticed one of them whispering. Lila noticed too. Her hands tightened on the wheels. He leaned over and whispered, "We belong here, okay?" She didn't answer, but she didn't wheel away either. That night, Daniel stayed up late researching HOA harassment cases. The internet was full of horror stories, boards with unchecked power, residents bullied into submission, and always the same pattern: silence, escalation, then destruction. But those were other stories. This wouldn't be theirs. He wouldn't let it. Then came the moment that would echo in his mind forever. It was a Sunday morning, sunny and calm, when Daniel and Lila rolled along Maple Trail, the scenic loop that bordered the edge of Willow Ridge. Birds chirped in the trees. Mabel barked playfully at a squirrel. For a brief moment, the world felt right, until they passed a house with pink roses and a white picket fence. A woman stood at the mailbox, tall, with bleached blonde hair tied into a tight bun and sunglasses too big for her face. She didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there, eyes fixed on Lila. When they passed her, she tilted her head and spoke, not to them, but to the air. Disgusting. We don't allow devices like that here. Daniel stopped. What did you say? He asked calmly, but with fire boiling beneath. The woman smiled without her eyes and turned toward her porch. Read your HOA handbook, sir. This isn't a hospital zone. Daniel stood frozen, heart racing, trying to absorb the venom of her words. Lila looked up at him, her eyes wide, questioning not just what the woman meant, but why someone would ever say such a thing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand answers. But he also knew this was just the beginning. Because people like that, they don't stop. They escalate. And Daniel had no idea yet just how far this woman, this community would go. But he would soon. And when they did, he'd be ready. The name on the official HOA welcome packet was Cynthia Harrow. It came a few days after that disturbing encounter on Maple Trail. Daniel found it on his doorstep, wrapped in a crisp blue folder sealed with a Willow Ridge Estates emblem, 2 oak trees crossing over a golden gate. Inside were the community guidelines, bylaws, a pamphlet about lawn care restrictions, and a typed letter signed by President Cynthia Harrow. It was all perfectly polite. Too polite. Phrases like enforcing community standards with pride and ensuring harmony among all residents filled every line. And yet, between every word, Daniel felt the chill of something else: control. Surveillance. An HOA not designed for fairness or inclusion, but for enforcement and power. And Cynthia Harrow? She was the iron fist behind it all. The very next day, Daniel received his first violation notice, a printed warning tucked into his mailbox and uploaded to the HOA portal. The reason? Unauthorized external modification to front access area. Translation: the ramp. He double-checked the bylaws. His ramp was temporary, modular, and clearly allowed by ADA laws. But that didn't stop the HOA from issuing a first strike, threatening fines if he didn't restore the porch to its original design. He reached out to Cynthia via the contact number listed. It went straight to voicemail. He emailed. No response. So he decided to show up in person during the weekly HOA office hours, hosted in a small stucco building behind the community garden. The moment he stepped into the room, Daniel felt the hostility. Cynthia sat behind a mahogany desk, surrounded by framed certificates. Her hair was flawless, her smile surgical, but her eyes were ice. "You must be Mr. Carter," she said, not rising. Daniel extended a hand. She didn't take it. He took a breath. "I wanted to discuss the violation notice." "The ramp for my daughter, the wheelchair ramp," she interrupted, her voice clipped. "Yes, I'm aware. It's within ADA compliance. Temporary. I didn't think I needed. In Willow Ridge, we take aesthetics very seriously," Cynthia said, folding her hands. "We encourage accessibility, of course, but within reason. Modifications must be pre-approved to maintain our uniform look. You should have submitted a formal request." "My daughter can't enter the house without that ramp," Daniel said flatly. "Then perhaps you should have considered that before purchasing a home in a community with high standards." The words hit like a slap. Daniel stared at her, stunned. She reached for a stack of files and pretended to browse. "I'll be expecting your application," she added, not looking up. He left before he said something he'd regret. That evening, he told Lila they'd have to make some changes. She only nodded, her way of saying she understood but didn't agree. Daniel felt the weight of her silence. It was a silence that screamed louder than words. The next week brought a new wave of pettiness. The HOA claimed that the service dog, Mabel, needed registration paperwork approved by the board, something completely illegal under federal law. When Daniel cited the ADA, the HOA responded with a vague email about exemptions not applying to private neighborhood agreements. Soon after, the garbage collection company accidentally began skipping their house. Daniel made 5 calls. No one answered. When he placed the bins himself at the curb of the adjacent property, they were mysteriously gone the next morning, bins, trash, and all. Lila started to feel it too. She stopped asking to go outside. She'd stare out the window and watch the other kids play, gripping the arms of her chair tighter each day. Daniel tried to keep her distracted. Puzzles, painting, evening stories, but even Mabel couldn't shake her growing unease. Then the second violation came in. This time, it wasn't about the ramp. It was about noise complaints filed during Lila's wheelchair movement across the driveway. The accusation claimed that the constant rolling created a disturbance early in the morning. Daniel laughed when he read it, an angry, disbelieving laugh. His daughter rolled out for her school bus at 7:40 a.m. That's when half the community was already running leaf blowers and sipping coffee outside. It was absurd, but it was real. A few days later, Daniel caught Cynthia standing across the street with a clipboard, watching. She pretended to be inspecting another lawn, but her eyes kept flicking toward their house. Then came the spray paint. One night, Daniel woke to Mabel barking furiously. He rushed outside to find the words "NO Rolling Zone" sprayed in red across his driveway. Lila saw it the next morning. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply turned her chair around and rolled back into the house. Daniel took a picture and filed a police report. The officer, polite but dismissive, said they'd look into it. No cameras, no witnesses, no suspect. Daniel confronted the HOA. They said it was regrettable and promised to circulate a newsletter about neighborly conduct. No follow-up, no action. Cynthia didn't even acknowledge his email. It became clear this wasn't just about rules. It was a power play, a sick game of intimidation and isolation. Cynthia wanted them gone. Daniel didn't know why, whether it was pure hatred, discrimination, or some twisted desire to enforce control. But it was real, and it was escalating. What she didn't know, what no one in that pristine neighborhood knew, was that Daniel Carter wasn't some spineless pushover. He'd carried children out of burning buildings. He'd fought flames that reached 40 feet in the air. He'd sat beside a hospital bed for 6 months, waiting for his daughter to open her eyes. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. Even if he had to burn this HOA to the ground, legally, publicly, and completely to protect his daughter's right to live in peace. But Cynthia? She was just getting started. What began as paper violations and silent glares quickly turned into something far darker. Daniel knew the signs: small acts, escalating aggression, a neighborhood slowly weaponized by one person's twisted sense of control. And at the center of it all stood Cynthia Harrow, orchestrating every move like a conductor guiding a symphony of cruelty. The next strike came on a Thursday morning. Daniel had just finished packing Lila's lunch when a sharp knock rattled the front door. He opened it to find a man in a gray uniform and clipboard. HOA compliance officer, the patch on his shoulder read. His expression was stiff, forcefully polite. "Morning, sir. Routine inspection. I need to measure your ramp incline," he said, stepping forward without waiting for an invitation. Daniel stopped him cold. "Do you have a warrant or a legal order to step onto my property?" The man hesitated. HOA regulation gives us the right to verify code adherence. ADA law gives me the right to keep my daughter safe and mobile. You can take your clipboard and shove it until you come back with something signed by a judge. The man huffed, scribbled something, and left without another word. The next morning, Daniel received an official violation citing hostile interference with community staff, accompanied by a $150 fine and a scheduled mandatory board hearing. That same day, Daniel noticed the ramp had been tampered with. One of the screws at the base was loose, not just weather-worn, but turned halfway out, like someone had done it intentionally. He checked the others. 2 more were suspiciously loose. It was enough to make the incline unstable, especially for a child in a wheelchair. He stared at it in disbelief, rage rising through his chest like smoke. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was sabotage. When Lila came home from school, Daniel didn't say a word about the screws. He reinforced every bolt, added a locking bracket, and spent the evening quietly installing a Wi-Fi camera on the porch, angled low, discreetly pointed toward the ramp. What the camera would later capture would shock him to his core, but that moment was still a few days away. That weekend, the community held its annual spring social at the clubhouse, a polished white building with tall columns, nestled beside the artificial lake. Lila, still hopeful despite everything, asked if they could go. She missed being around other kids. She missed laughter. Daniel hesitated, but eventually gave in. Maybe, he thought, showing up would remind the neighborhood that they were just a father and daughter trying to live. They dressed nice. Lila wore her favorite purple sweater, and Daniel even shaved. Mabel wore her service vest, badge gleaming in the sunlight. But from the moment they arrived, the air shifted. Conversations died when they approached. Kids were pulled aside. Plates stopped clinking. It was as if a shadow had entered the room. Cynthia stood near the buffet, holding a glass of white wine, smiling like a pageant queen. When she spotted Lila, her expression changed just for a moment, a flicker of disgust. Then calmly she walked over. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her tone honeyed. "Did you get our notice about the upcoming board hearing?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I did. And yet, you still thought it appropriate to bring this into a community event?" He blinked. "This? You mean my daughter?" "I mean the device. We have regulations regarding rolling hardware inside communal spaces. It's a wheelchair, Cynthia. She needs it to move." Cynthia's lips pressed into a tight line. "We all have needs, but this is a family space. Your daughter's equipment is distracting. It makes people uncomfortable." Daniel felt his fists clench at his sides. Lila shrank back slightly in her chair. "She's a 10-year-old girl," he said, voice low, dangerous. "Not a bulldozer." "You're escalating things, Mr. Carter." Again, Cynthia said smoothly, "If you'd like to discuss this further, I suggest you bring legal representation to your hearing. Otherwise, we'll have no choice but to proceed with enforcement." Enforcement, like they were criminals. Daniel didn't say another word. He turned, wheeled Lila around, and left. People parted like the Red Sea as they exited. That night, Lila didn't eat dinner. She stayed curled up with Mabel, whispering into the dog's ear. When Daniel asked what she was saying, she whispered back, "I was telling her I'm sorry for being a problem." Daniel's heart broke all over again. The next morning, he reviewed the porch camera footage, and there it was, a shadowy figure approaching just after midnight. A woman in a hoodie, thin build, glancing around. She stepped up to the ramp, pulled a small tool from her pocket, and crouched. In a few short minutes, she tampered with 3 screws, then disappeared down the street. Daniel enhanced the footage, paused, zoomed. The frame caught her profile as she glanced toward the streetlight. Even in grainy night vision, it was unmistakable. Cynthia. He sent the footage to the police. They confirmed it was enough to launch an inquiry. But nothing would happen overnight. Daniel knew that. Still, something shifted in him. This was no longer about citations or social rejection. This was deliberate endangerment of a child. And Lila? She was fading fast. She began avoiding school, clinging to Mabel like a lifeline. Daniel found a crumpled drawing in the trash, a stick figure in a wheelchair beside a broken ramp, surrounded by frowns. The words, "I don't belong," scrawled in shaky pencil at the top. He taped it to the refrigerator, not as a decoration, but as a reminder. This war was no longer silent. Cynthia had made it physical. She had crossed every moral line. And Daniel? He'd been patient, civil, lawful. But he had limits. And Cynthia was about to discover exactly what happened when a father's last thread of restraint snapped. Because the next move would be his, and it wouldn't be subtle. The day started like any other spring Saturday, birds chirping, lawnmowers buzzing faintly in the distance, and Daniel brewing his second cup of coffee while Lila sat by the window brushing Mabel's fur. The tension that had gripped their home for weeks had settled into a quiet numbness. It was a survival rhythm. Daniel didn't know it yet, but that would be the last morning his daughter felt even remotely safe in Willow Ridge. A community-wide event had been announced earlier in the week, a Patriot Barbecue and Family Appreciation Day, hosted at the Lakeside Green near the clubhouse. Daniel had planned to skip it until Lila timidly asked, "Can we try one more time?" Her eyes, hopeful but hesitant, were enough. She was still clinging to the idea that not everyone in this neighborhood was like Cynthia. They arrived at noon, dressed casually. Lila had her rainbow headband on, the one she always wore when she wanted to feel extra brave. Daniel carried a small picnic basket. Mabel walked proudly beside them, vest on, tail swaying gently. As they approached the event, things seemed normal. Kids ran near the bounce house. Smoke curled from grills manned by neighborhood dads. Folding tables held bowls of chips, lemonade jugs, and patriotic paper plates. But the moment Lila's wheels touched the grass, the change was instant. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Several people turned their backs. Others stared openly, whispering. It was like a switch had flipped. Cynthia stood near the gazebo, dressed in a crisp red blouse, holding a clipboard as always. A smug smile tugged at her lips when she noticed them. Daniel felt the chill in his gut, but he nodded politely and kept rolling Lila forward. They found an open spot under a tree near the lake. Daniel laid out the blanket and handed Lila a sandwich. For a few quiet minutes, it almost felt okay again. But then, Cynthia's voice sliced through the air. "Mr. Carter, we've discussed this." Daniel turned to see her marching toward them, heels snapping against the pavement. "This event is for able-bodied recreation. That includes a no-rolling device policy on the central lawn for safety." Daniel stood slowly. "That's not a policy. That's you inventing nonsense because you don't like my daughter." Mabel growled softly. Cynthia's smile vanished. "You need to leave this area immediately. And take that beast with you." Daniel's voice dropped. "That beast is a federally recognized service animal. And my daughter has every right to be here." Several neighbors had turned their attention to the confrontation. Some whispered. Some looked away. No one intervened. Then Cynthia's hand went to her purse. It happened so fast. She reached in, pulled out a compact silver handgun, and pointed it not directly at Lila, but toward the ground at her wheels. Her voice trembled with rage. "I said no. Rolling devices." Bang! The shot echoed like a thunderclap across the field. Birds scattered. Children screamed. Plates hit the ground. Lila froze. Her whole body jerked. Then she screamed, a sound Daniel hadn't heard since the hospital. He lunged forward and tackled Cynthia, knocking the gun from her hand. It skidded across the grass. Mabel barked furiously, standing between Lila and the chaos. A man ran forward and pulled Daniel off Cynthia, another HOA board member named Craig, who had always kept his distance. "You just assaulted the HOA president," he shouted. "She fired a gun next to my daughter's wheelchair." Daniel roared, trying to break free. But it didn't matter. In the minutes that followed, sirens wailed, and the police arrived, responding to a call that had claimed an unhinged man attacked a woman at a family gathering. That's what Craig reported. That's what the witnesses loyal to Cynthia echoed. Daniel tried to explain. He pointed at Lila, still shaking uncontrollably in her chair, unable to speak. He showed them the scorch mark in the grass, the gun, the camera on Mabel's vest, but it hadn't been recording. Still, they cuffed him. "You have the right to remain silent," Lila sobbed as Mabel pressed against her lap. Neighbors watched, some filming, others gossiping under their breath. Only one older woman, who had never spoken to Daniel before, whispered, "This isn't right." At the station, Daniel gave his statement. One officer, a younger cop named Reyes, seemed to believe him, but said they needed more evidence. Her firearm was legal and registered. The angle of the shot shows it was fired downward. She claims she felt threatened, Reyes said with clear discomfort. "You tackled her in front of 20 people. She screamed at a child and shot at her feet." Daniel replied, fists clenched. And that's why I've recommended this be escalated to internal review, Reyes said carefully. But you should know, the HOA board has a lot of local influence. Daniel was released later that night, no formal charges yet, but under investigation for assault. He walked home under the cover of dark, his shirt stained, his muscles sore, but his heart utterly shattered. When he entered the house, Lila sat in her chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket Mabel curled at her feet. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. She didn't even flinch when Daniel knelt in front of her. Something inside her had broken again. And Cynthia? She wasn't in jail. She wasn't even ashamed. By morning, a public statement from the HOA circulated via email. An unfortunate incident occurred at yesterday's event involving a disruptive resident. Our board president acted within her rights to protect herself and others. Daniel stared at the screen. His hands shook with fury. They had twisted the truth into a weapon, but he wasn't done. Because this time, they hadn't just tried to push him out. They had traumatized his daughter. And that was a line they should never have crossed. This wasn't just an HOA war anymore. It was personal. And Daniel Carter was about to make the world hear exactly what Cynthia Harrow had done. The morning after the shooting, Daniel sat alone in the living room, staring at the cold cup of coffee in his hands. The house was quiet, too quiet. Lila hadn't said a single word since the incident. She hadn't even cried. She just sat, wrapped in her blanket, silently petting Mabel, her eyes glassy and far away. Daniel knew that look. It was the same hollow gaze she'd worn after the accident. He couldn't let her slip into that place again. Not because of a woman who abused her authority and nearly fired a gun at a child in a wheelchair and got away with it. Not because of a neighborhood that turned its back on them when they needed it most. The HOA might have painted him as unstable, and Cynthia might have twisted the narrative, but Daniel knew the truth. And somewhere in this carefully crafted, ivy-wrapped lie of a community, he was going to find proof. He began by diving into public records. For hours, he combed through property filings, tax documents, and court databases, searching for anything on Cynthia Harrow. Her name wasn't listed as the original owner of her home. In fact, she hadn't even lived in Willow Ridge that long, just under 3 years. Strange, considering how thoroughly she controlled everything. Then he found it, buried in an online court archive under the name Cynthia L. Weaver, her maiden name. There it was, a sealed lawsuit from her previous HOA in a community called Deerfield Reserve. The case summary mentioned a Class 3 discharge of a firearm in a non-defense scenario, emotional distress, and wrongful HOA enforcement. Most of the details were hidden, settled out of court. Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't the first time. He dug deeper. Using a public forum for HOA disputes, he found a thread with dozens of comments about a woman who weaponized HOA rules to drive out families she didn't like. Someone named Retired Vet 47 posted, "She pulled a gun on my grandson for skateboarding on the sidewalk," called it threatening movement. Daniel reached out privately, and the man responded within hours. His name was George Rayburn, and he didn't just know Cynthia. He had been one of the original board members before she took over. She doesn't care about rules, George explained on a call. She cares about control. She bullies the weak, pushes out families she doesn't like, and keeps the board stocked with cowards who owe her favors. Did she ever get charged? Daniel asked. Not really. She always has some story, felt threatened, was protecting property, they were aggressive. She knows how to play the victim while holding the smoking gun. George agreed to send Daniel everything he had, old emails, community complaints, board minutes from Deerfield. It was a gold mine of patterns. Cynthia was no rookie. She was a repeat offender, perfectly camouflaged behind HOA authority. Then came the footage. The porch camera had caught Cynthia tampering with the ramp. Daniel had already turned that over to the police. But when he pulled the full security logs from his cloud account, he found another clip from the night after the barbecue shooting. Cynthia standing across the street at 2 a.m., staring at their house, not moving, just watching, like a predator studying its prey. It chilled him to the bone. He sent the files to Officer Reyes at the precinct. Reyes, to his credit, responded quickly. "This is bad," he admitted, "but without clear proof the firearm was aimed at your daughter, it's still going to be hard to build a criminal case." The HOA board statements all align with Cynthia's. But this pattern, this prior history, this changes things. "I'm escalating this to our district attorney." Daniel wasn't done. He called a lawyer, Angela Morgan, an ADA rights specialist and civil litigator. Her voice was sharp, controlled, and full of quiet fury after she saw the footage. "This is more than harassment," she said. "This is a coordinated campaign of discrimination and intimidation against a disabled child. It violates federal ADA laws, state civil rights protections, and possibly multiple criminal statutes." Angela began building a case immediately, gathering evidence, collecting affidavits, preparing a press release. Meanwhile, Daniel printed the ramp footage and handed it out to neighbors. Some shut their doors. Others, including a few parents, began asking quiet questions. A woman named Jessica, who lived 2 blocks over, whispered, "We didn't know. We thought she was protecting us." But not everyone was ready to speak up. Cynthia's grip on the board was tight. One member, after Daniel approached him in the parking lot, said flatly, "If I help you, I lose my house." That evening, Daniel sat with Lila and showed her the footage. He explained, slowly and gently, that Cynthia had tried to make her feel unwanted. But she was the one who had done wrong. Lila didn't speak. Instead, she reached for her art notebook, something she hadn't touched in weeks, and began to draw. It was a picture of Mabel sitting like a superhero guarding her wheelchair. Daniel smiled through tears. That night, Lila slipped a folded piece of paper under his door. It read, "Let's stop her. For everyone like me." The next morning, Daniel received an unexpected email. It was from someone named Erica Moore, a former HOA board secretary who had resigned 6 months ago. Her message was short. "I know what you did. I saw the minutes they erased. I'll talk." Attached was a scanned copy of a redacted board meeting summary with the original handwritten version beneath it. The official record claimed Daniel had created a public disturbance, but the Rayall notes revealed that Cynthia had admitted to displaying her firearm as a deterrent and had asked the board to help her discredit the Carter family before legal trouble spreads. Erica was scared, but ready. Daniel sent everything to Angela. The case was coming together. The lies were unraveling, and in the heart of Willow Ridge, behind manicured lawns and matching mailboxes, the truth was about to ignite a fire that no HOA rulebook could smother. Because Daniel Carter wasn't just fighting back anymore. He was building a reckoning. Daniel wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake. He wasn't out to make Cynthia Harrow feel pain, at least not the kind she inflicted on others. What he wanted was justice. A reckoning that would pierce the illusion of power she had built around herself with fake smiles, weaponized rules, and the cowardice of those who stayed silent. But to do that, he needed more than outrage. He needed evidence, allies, a plan. With Angela Morgan, his lawyer, spearheading the civil case, Daniel focused on something just as important: exposure. If the law moved slowly, public pressure would not. And the truth had been suppressed in Willow Ridge for too long. Angela began assembling a formal complaint citing ADA violations, emotional trauma, civil harassment, and reckless endangerment with a firearm. Daniel provided security footage, written statements from Erica Moore and George Rayburn, and Lila's own heartbreaking journal entries that documented weeks of silent suffering. The sheer pattern of abuse was undeniable. Meanwhile, Daniel contacted a local journalist from Channel 9 News, a woman named Tasha Glenn, known for her stories on government overreach and community corruption. He sent her a summary raw footage and a simple message: an HOA president pulled a gun on a disabled child. The board helped her cover it up. Tasha called within the hour. "I've covered police brutality, school board scandals, and corrupt city councils," she said. "But this is the kind of story that makes people furious. I want to hear everything." She interviewed Daniel at his kitchen table, her camera crew capturing the stripped-down, brutal truth of what had happened. Not the polished statements the HOA board issued, but the lived reality of a little girl too terrified to play outside and a father desperate to protect her. The story aired the following Tuesday. The headline was unmissable. HOA president accused of pulling gun on disabled child. Community remains silent. The internet exploded. Social media took over, with hashtags like hashtag Justice for Lila and hashtag HOA Karen exposed trending within 24 hours. Thousands of comments poured in from parents of disabled kids, military veterans, civil rights advocates, and angry homeowners across the country. Donations to Lila's medical and legal fund soared. More importantly, the silence inside Willow Ridge began to crack. It started with anonymous notes slipped under Daniel's door. "I'm sorry. I saw what happened. We were scared to speak out. Thank you for fighting. We wanted to, but didn't know how." Then came the volunteers. Jessica, the quiet neighbor who once avoided eye contact, brought over flyers for an emergency neighborhood meeting, one not sanctioned by the HOA. Daniel stood at that meeting, held in a garage with folding chairs and warm lemonade, and told them everything. Not just about Cynthia's gun, but the fines, the sabotage, the lies, the fear. "I didn't come here to make enemies," he said. "I came to build a life for my daughter." But what we found was a system that treats kindness like a weakness and silence like loyalty. That ends today. The room erupted in applause. Then came the town hall. Angela filed a legal injunction against Cynthia Harrow and the HOA board to prevent further retaliation while the civil lawsuit progressed. At the same time, Tasha's news crew organized a live televised panel discussion featuring Daniel, Angela, and a retired ADA compliance officer who called Cynthia's actions one of the clearest cases of community-level discrimination I've ever seen. The pressure mounted. Sponsors pulled their support from Willow Ridge's Neighborhood magazine. A local disability rights group called for Cynthia's immediate resignation. HOA residents held signs on their lawns. "We stand with Lila. No more silence. Our neighborhood is not equal to her kingdom." Cynthia responded with venom. She filed a defamation suit against Daniel, accused him of staging the ramp tampering, claimed Lila's trauma was coached. She doubled down in a Facebook Live rant, calling Daniel an opportunist father exploiting his daughter's situation. But this time, the world was watching. Angela counterfiled with a cease and desist and handed over audio from Erica Moore, a chilling 20-minute recording from a private board meeting where Cynthia said, "We don't need kids like that on our sidewalks. He wants a lawsuit? I'll bury him in policy violations until he folds." That recording went viral overnight. Even Cynthia's most loyal allies abandoned ship. Board members resigned en masse. Craig, the man who once pulled Daniel off Cynthia after the shooting, came forward publicly. "She told us to lie," he admitted in a press conference. "She told us if we didn't back her up, she'd come after our homes next. And we believed her. But it was wrong. She lied. She put that little girl in danger. We were complicit." The HOA was officially dissolved under legal intervention. A court-appointed administrator took over. All fines against Daniel were dropped. The gun incident was reclassified as reckless endangerment of a minor, and Cynthia was arrested pending trial. As they led her away in handcuffs, her mask finally cracked. She screamed at Daniel, called him a liar, a manipulator. She looked at Lila and shouted, "This was all a show." Daniel stepped in front of his daughter and stared her down with quiet resolve. "No, Cynthia," he said, "the show's over, and you're the villain everyone came to see." Cheers erupted from the small crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse. Camera flashes lit up the sidewalk. Lila clutched Mabel and smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile, a safe smile. Back at home, Daniel looked out the window, where neighbors were planting a flower bed in front of his lawn. One of them, Jessica, handed Lila a paintbrush. "We're repainting your flower box," she said. "Want to help?" Lila nodded. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. The color returned to her cheeks, the light to her eyes. Daniel stood on the porch and finally exhaled. He hadn't just protected his daughter. He'd ignited a fire that burned through every lie, every cover-up, every rule twisted into a weapon. And now, with the world watching, he knew one thing for certain: Cynthia Harrow would never hurt another family again. The courthouse was silent except for the measured clack of Cynthia Harrow's heels as she was escorted in by two deputies. The woman who once stood at the top of Willow Ridge's power structure now wore county-issued khakis, her posture rigid but her expression hollow. Her arraignment had drawn local news, disability rights advocates, and over a dozen of her former neighbors, none there to support her. She was officially charged with assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment of a minor, civil harassment, and ADA violations. But for Daniel, no set of charges could truly capture the months of fear, isolation, and rage she had inflicted, not just on him, but on his daughter. Still, watching her stand behind the glass panel as the charges were read aloud felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Her arrest had triggered a chain reaction. The HOA board, which once operated like a silent syndicate, crumbled within 2 weeks of the public outcry. For members, including Treasurer Alan York and Secretary Jeanette Miles, were found to have knowingly falsified reports to protect Cynthia and obstruct the investigation. All were fined and barred from holding any HOA-related position in the state. Several residents demanded full reimbursement of wrongfully issued fines, and a class action suit was quietly taking form behind the scenes. But the most important victory came just a few weeks later in civil court. The judge's ruling was swift and scathing. Daniel and Lila Winslow were awarded $3.2 million in damages. The breakdown was detailed: emotional trauma and medical care for Lila, defamation and punitive damages against Cynthia, legal costs and property damages, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Daniel didn't celebrate the number. He didn't want revenge money. He wanted something good to come from it. That same night, he met with Angela Morgan and said, "Let's build something, not just for Lila, for every kid who's been treated like she doesn't belong." From that moment, the Winslow Foundation for Accessible Communities was born, nonprofit dedicated to protecting the rights of disabled children in HOA-governed neighborhoods. Within 2 months, they launched a hotline for reporting discrimination, a legal aid initiative, and a grant program to help families build accessible infrastructure without HOA obstruction. The launch event was held in Willow Ridge, of all places, in the same community center where Cynthia once presided over board meetings like a queen on a throne. This time, however, the banners were different. Every child belongs. Roll forward, never back. Strength in every step, even wheels. Daniel stood behind the podium, taking in the crowd, not of reporters or skeptics, but of neighbors. Familiar faces. Some once silent, some complicit, all now changed. He cleared his throat. This foundation isn't just about what happened to my daughter. It's about what we let happen, what we turn away from. It's about making sure no child is ever told again that they don't belong in their own neighborhood. Then came the moment no one expected. Lila rolled forward, her sunflower dress fluttering slightly under the warm breeze. She looked healthier now, her cheeks rosy, her curls bouncing, Mabel clutched in one hand. Daniel knelt beside her and handed her a small microphone. She hesitated. The crowd quieted. Her voice came out soft, barely a whisper. "My name is Lila Winslow, and I'm not scared anymore." A collective gasp moved through the crowd. Tears flowed freely, even from those who had once crossed the street to avoid Daniel's house. Erica Moore placed a hand over her heart. George Rayburn nodded solemnly. Jessica, who had once only watched from her window, clapped the loudest. Lila smiled. Daniel cried. After the event, neighbors came up one by one. Some hugged him. Others simply said, "I'm sorry." But it was one older woman, Mrs. Caldwell, who had lived across from them for years, who summed it up best. "We were scared," she said, eyes glistening, "but we saw your strength. And your daughters. Thank you for not giving up, even when we did." Daniel nodded, overwhelmed. Back at their house, things were different now, not in the way money changes things, but in the way healing does. The flower bed Lila once planted was in full bloom again, a mosaic of violets and golden marigolds. Daniel had built a custom wheelchair ramp with a mural Lila helped paint, a wide path through a forest with the words "Free TO beaming across the sky." There were no more warning letters, no more hostile stares, just peace. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch watching Lila play catch with Jessica's grandson, he looked up at the sky and whispered, "We made it, baby girl. We made it." She wheeled up beside him and offered him Mabel, who now wore a tiny handmade cape. "She's a hero," Lila said. Daniel looked at the doll, then at his daughter. "No," he said, "you are." In the quiet of that evening, under the soft hum of cicadas and the faint laughter of children, Daniel finally let go of the storm that had once consumed them. Not because justice had been served, but because something greater had grown in its place: hope. And this time it had roots. Months had passed since the courtroom lights dimmed, the final verdict etched into public record. Cynthia Harrow was behind bars, stripped of her HOA crown and silenced by the very laws she used to twist. The neighborhood of Willow Ridge had begun its slow journey toward redemption. Yet for Daniel Winslow, the story didn't end with a gavel slam or a check with a lot of zeros. Because deep down, he knew the real villain wasn't just Cynthia. She was a symptom, not the disease. It wasn't just about a woman with a gun or her hatred of wheelchairs or her obsession with order. It was about a system that let her rise, let her act, and then looked away when she crossed every line. A system where silence was compliance and power was passed quietly in email chains and backdoor votes. It was about the dozens of residents who nodded along with her edicts, who watched Lila struggle to access a community center and said nothing. Karen had a name, yes, but Karenism was faceless. It hid in every HOA board meeting where no one asked, "Should we really ban ramps?" It whispered in every neighbor's living room who said, "It's not my problem," when Lila was targeted. It thrived in the gray space between law and morality, protected by red tape and polite cowardice. Daniel's lawsuit had shaken the foundation. His nonprofit was growing. But the roots of what happened ran deeper than Willow Ridge. Across the country, he received emails every week. "Our HOA threatened to fine us for installing a stair lift. My daughter was told her hearing aid was a disruptive device. We got fined because our van had a wheelchair sticker." The stories echoed his own. Different cities, same blueprint. So Daniel pivoted. The Winslow Foundation expanded beyond community grants. They began compiling a national report on HOA discrimination, the first of its kind, and lobbying state representatives to amend the Fair Housing Act to include stricter enforcement within HOA zones. Angela Morgan, who had once fought alone as a disability rights lawyer, now had a full legal team under her. Together, they filed strategic lawsuits against two of the largest HOA management companies in the country. Both quietly settled within months. Justice, it turned out, was contagious. But even with the victories, Daniel couldn't shake the bitter truth. It took a child almost dying for people to care. And even then, many cared only because it made headlines. That haunted him. One rainy afternoon, Lila sat beside him, legs curled up on the couch, flipping through a scrapbook of news clippings and letters supporters had sent. "Do you think he'll stop now?" she asked, tracing her finger across a photo of the protest held in her name. Daniel hesitated. "I think it's harder to stay quiet now. That's a start." Lila nodded. "I hope other kids don't have to fight like we did." He wished he could promise that. But change came slow, slower than injustice. Still, it came. The new HOA board at Willow Ridge had rewritten its entire charter, this time with public input. They made disability awareness training mandatory for all committee members. The words inclusion, integrity, accountability were etched on a plaque outside the clubhouse, where once only HOA bylaws hung. And Cynthia? She eventually gave a televised apology from prison, one clearly written by lawyers. "I deeply regret my actions," she said, eyes blank, "and I wish the Winslow family healing." Daniel watched it once, then deleted the clip. He didn't need her regret. He needed a world where people like her never got that much power in the first place. The irony was never lost on him. Cynthia claimed to stand for order and community, but the only time Willow Ridge truly became a community was after she was gone. On the first anniversary of the incident, Daniel and Lila planted a tree in the park, a sturdy oak with a bronze plaque beneath it that read, "For the children who were told no. May they always find a way to roll forward." Residents gathered around. Some cried. Some hugged Lila. One little boy in a bright red wheelchair handed her a drawing of Mabel wearing a crown. She laughed. Daniel smiled. It wasn't the ending he imagined. It was better, because the story didn't end with Cynthia's downfall. It ended with a movement. It ended with people finally seeing not just the girl in the chair, but the barriers around her and the power of tearing those barriers down. And as the wind rustled the new oak leaves above them, Daniel knew the real villain had been unmasked. Not a person, but a mindset, and the fight against it had only just begun. If this story moved you, subscribe to HOA Denied Access, where truth meets justice and voices like Lila's are never silenced.